how do you start a classic D&D campaign? How do you get it started? This is technically the third episode in a series. You don't really need to necessarily watch the other two, but you can go back and check those on the playlist if you want to. But this is basically, if you want to start a campaign, a D&D campaign that is very open and what some people call sandboxy and involves a lot of player choice, and it's really challenging, it's a kind of challenging gameplay situation, then it's a question to ask, because lots of things you can buy or that have been published over the last 40 years, certainly the last 35 years, are going to pull you in a different direction, whether you're playing D&D or indeed other role-playing games. They're going to be much more linear, they're going to be much more story-based, and some people really like that. But what if you want to do something that's a bit different and maybe harks back a bit to some of the earliest Dungeons and Dragons campaigns? So, classic D&D. We'll pick up a bit of what that means, just to explain it in more definition in a moment. But I'm going to assume, when I say how do you start a campaign, I'm going to assume you have players and they're not all sociopaths. And I assume that because a lot of DMing advice falls into this category of personnel management and social skills, soft skill stuff. And that's actually all quite important when you realise that there are a bunch of kind of social dynamics going on in any game, sure. But this is a series about what makes a game classic D&D and how to press that paradigm of D&D. So I'm not going to give you any soft skill advice, that you can find it elsewhere, or you can develop it through hard experience like the rest of us. So here's one thing to think when we talk about this paradigm of classic D&D. Rather than being like, oh, I'm creating a campaign, should I go? And this is, you look at other advice, and some of it I'm sure good, but should you go bottom up or top down? Should you write everything and have this, or at least write loads of really high level important stuff that sets up a really rich setting? Or should you go bottom up and build from what the players engage with, or from day one? And both of them can have merit. And I suppose if I was held at gunpoint and had to say which I thought was the way to go, I'd say something like, oh, bottom up. But really, I think the framing it can be improved on. I think instead you should think what you need to run a classic game. You're like, I want to run a classic D&D game, and one reason for the bottom up approach being generally good is you don't know if it'll make it to a campaign. Why don't you just have a good adventure the players turn up to at the first session? You are entering you're in the village of Homlet. You're at the Keep of the Borderlands. You've been told you need to go to the Caves of Chaos. Whatever it is, whatever the basic setup is something really solid, and then the rest of it can look after itself if the players come back. That is good. That is true. But there's circumstances where you're planning for something a bit. You're thinking, I want to run this for longer, or maybe you're playing with friends and you already know they will play for more than one session. So in that case, you should reframe it as, what do I need in my campaign to run a classic D&D game? And I've talked about three pillars on this. The pillars are world first, player driven, and challenge oriented. World first, the world has to have some sort of logic and coherence that's separate from telling stories to the players, not because the players aren't going to be in the world, but because the players need to be able to understand it, and it needs to have its own reasoning. It needs to be something in that sense independent from the players. Second, it needs to be player driven. Stories are actually very much that you tell to your players are not player driven, they're DM driven. The player deciding what the story is by going around the world and doing stuff, that's player driven. And challenge oriented, this is a game, this is a classic adventure game, fantasy adventure game, Gary Gygax would call it. And in that case, it needs to be something which is challenging in the way games can be. I mean, video games, board games, whatever good game you can think of that you're like, oh, that really provides a knotty challenge to me. This is not, in that sense, though it creates stories, classic D&D is not driven by the stories. It creates stories from these other elements. So think in terms of, how do I create a campaign that rests on those three pillars, rather than maybe rather than like, oh, what do I need to write in this world to make it make sense, or what's the list of arbitrary components that I've got off a blog. Instead think in terms of purpose, in terms of what you're there to do. And so what I'm going to do is we'll talk about the 3 pillars, just summing up some of how they're relevant, and then I'll give 3 examples, one of 3 types of campaign, I think, roughly, and that I think can fit this dynamic, and just we'll talk about how they do that. And they're all ones I've reviewed on this channel, in fact. So world first, it doesn't mean, saying world first does not mean you need to write down a whole fictional world or work out the weather patterns. If you want weather patterns, you can go to the World of Greyhawk box set, but the campaign, which is a great box set, the campaign needs a world with things going on in it, things that have their own logic, environment the players can come to understand. When I say world first, I do not mean world building first, like, oh, wow, I'm glad you've come up with the atlas of your fantasy world. It's that perhaps when you're thinking at the campaign level, you want to think more than just, oh, well, I've got a dungeon and we'll work out the rest of it afterwards. We're assuming, for the sake of our conversation here, that you're going to run a campaign in this world. And so you need to think, what will make this world have a dynamic that is independent of the players, interesting to the players, and comprehensible to the players. And so the world initially, I should say, if you're starting with first level PCs, you don't have to, but if you do, very common, or second level or whatever, it's going to be quite a small world. You need the logic of this, the areas the players can travel to. And remember, initially, they don't have horses. Horses, if a riding horse costs what, 75 gold, where's this money coming from? They're going to have to go to the dungeon even to get a horse to ride at any kind of speed anywhere else. If they are not riding, they're going to have lots more encounters while walking to other places, and because they're first level, second level, they're going to die. Basically, sooner rather than later in the wilderness. The wilderness is more dangerous than the dungeon, less controlled, less delineated. So you need to think, that's where the classic bottom-up approach of you need a town and a dungeon comes from. But I don't want to say, oh, you need a town and a dungeon. What I want to say is, what things here, how are these things going to interact? Just think, when you say to the players, you're in this place and, this is what's going on, how's it going to be, what's it going to be like without the players there? What happens? I think, by the way, N1, against the Cult of the Reptile God, some real strengths and some real flaws, but one strength is the suggestion of, oh, well, what will happen over time is, and Deep Carbon Observatory similarly, if the players don't interfere, this happens. So have some sense of, okay, what would happen without my players? Not because you need to have that happen, but because you want it to be, you want to be able to, one, extrapolate what happens if the players do X or Y. Two, you want to be able to say, okay, so this is the kind of place this is, and this is the logic on which it operates. And as the players find out more, that's what they're going to find out. That's what they're going to be picking into. So it's actually not about, oh, what are the big politics of the Great Kingdom? What's going on here? What's the weather patterns? It's, what do these orcs in this dungeon want? And what does the Burgermeister of the town want? Just think that. Just get those 2 things down, and think in terms of what would happen if the players weren't here, and therefore what are the players going to be discovering as they go around the world? What dynamics do they have to deal with? By the way, this covers a multitude of sin in some ways. That what happens is, as soon as you understand the basic logic there, you know what will happen in your DMing head when the players start asking questions. Say to the Burgermeister, can we do this? Can we do this? So yeah, world first, I think, just means understand the basic dynamics of this usually very small area that you're beginning in. And it can be fairly static, nothing much will change if the players aren't there, or it can be very dynamic. That doesn't matter. Just understand the logic of the place, and therefore, kind of what the player's going to be engaging with. Second, player driven. This means the players need to have choices. The game is about players getting to do stuff, to choose stuff, to make good or bad decisions, succeed or fail because of that. So to get going, you need to answer the question, what do the players get to choose in the campaign? And at every other level downward, but at the campaign level, what do the players get to choose? What are their early decisions? Again, these are probably low-level PCs in most campaigns, so the decisions are narrow and appropriate to their power level. Even if you're starting at 3rd level in Dark Sun, or indeed elsewhere, but Dark Sun classically starts at 3rd level, it's not like, okay, mission 1, are you going to kill Sorcerer King or the Dragon Boris? The question is, Are you going to go and kill, do this mercenary job to kill these antloids in some silver mines, or are you going to go and salvage rusted metal from ancient prehistoric ruins? That's the kind of decision they're making, right? And this does lead to, again, another aspect when we talk about the bottom-up approach. This is why when you're thinking, what do I need to have for the players to play? Well, if they've never played before, I think generally, a fairly narrow decision space to start with is very much, just start at the dungeon and so on. But even if that's what's happening, if you are thinking one step ahead, and that's usually only as far as you need to think, then you're going to be thinking, okay, there's a town, and maybe there's one other thing nearby. And this is a very basic thing. I mean, there's some difficulties here. There's some kind of stuff about, does it matter if the players can bounce between, there's some real meta level stuff here. It doesn't matter if they can bounce between dungeons, getting all the best content. What happens if they're over leveled? Gygax deals with this in the DMG, the first edition DMG. I'm not really addressing that. What I mean is, you need to think, just as in a dungeon, you need to think, okay, what is a meaningful choice for the players? Because if they go left and they go right, but the destination is the same and all the challenges are the same, there's not really any difference. If they're arbitrarily different, there's only a slight difference in the decision. If, however, one route is frozen caves and one route is a kind of crafted hallway, they could predict some of the difficulties they'll come into contact with and prepare themselves accordingly. And so at the campaign level, and I get this, I think about my players deciding, partly about prepping. It's just about boring stuff like prepping spells, but oh, where are we going today? But it's also kind of, what kind of challenges do we think we'll face? What characters do we need from our stables? They're like, oh, okay, this place we think is undead or demons or whatever. This place, this is orcs. We have different challenges, different things we need. Maybe we could bring different items. And when you're starting a campaign, that's not going to matter as much. But having stuff, I'm thinking about my experience of my Greyhawk campaign, which I've talked about before here. There you have the players start off and they end up wandering about a bit, and they actually go to Nulb early on, and of all things, their first adventure is trying to fight the giant Gar from the video game, but that I put in the campaign, and then losing and then going back to Homler. And then I put a couple of other kind of minor quests from the campaign around, from the video game around. And they went to the Declo Woods and they killed some spiders, and they lost one magic item, got another one because they set stuff on fire intelligently. Blah, blah, blah. The point was that they bounced off one thing and they didn't know what to do, and they were weakened, but they got to do another thing. And that also had risk, but that they could approach it in a different way. And they recruited allies and stuff. And it gave, in that sense, the players an ability to decide, well, we've heard about the bandit rumours, and we know there's this giant Gar near Nulb, and there's a ring of water walking on offer if we kill it, and we've heard there's a problem in the Declo Woods. What do we think we can do now? And I get that fairly regular, actually, to do with things like training windows, when some PCs aren't available but others are. But even at the start, there's a thing where the players can decide, do we prefer this challenge or this challenge? So I think my tendency, except in the extreme situation of this is the first time people have ever played D&D, stick them in the dungeon straight away. I think otherwise, even in that situation, but especially in others, you want to give some sense of, okay, the players start to forge their own path, and maybe there are consequences for not going for one thing rather than another. I sometimes have timers on events. I think I've talked about this in my Daggerford campaign diaries. I've got another one I'm going to record soon to talk about a different consequence of player action or inaction. But you can have consequences for them not pursuing one thing or pursuing another. But the point is, you want them to be able to feel like it's a tutorial lesson. They are the masters of their fate. They are the ones in control of being heroes in the world. And they're the ones who are going to change the destiny of the world, indeed, perhaps. But not via a pre-scripted story, but via them deciding to do things on a certain path. And even if the first choices are very minor, or ones which are essentially just aesthetic, I would rather fight undead than orcs. It sets up a general dynamic of player choice, and I think that is very important at the campaign level. And the third one, challenge oriented. Usually this is about early dungeon design, actually, rather than campaign design. It's not the high level of, oh, well, what's the challenge in the campaign? You can certainly consider the question at the higher level. What are the difficulties, major difficulties, players will face in this campaign? It might be relevant. In Dark Sun, tyranny in the cities, Dehydration in the desert. That creates barriers which have to be surmounted. And the players have to plan and think about how they're going to conquer those challenges. And I think that's good to think about in some campaigns. In others, the challenges, the high-level challenges, are not going to, initially at least, be at the level of the campaign. What I mean is, let's say the early rumours are there's a crypt in town which is said to have great treasure in it, in the abandoned the abandoned gardens of a hall, and they're said to have great treasure in them. And there's some raiding goblins on the road. Okay, well, what do we do first? And the players can think about what they want to do, and they do one or the other. Well, there's not really a campaign level challenge there. You've given them a decision, and there are some things that are going to be obstacles, like, you know, being caught breaking into a tomb in town might have consequences. But that's not what I mean. What I mean is the kinds of challenges they have to surmount or bypass in the course of an adventure, typically. And at the campaign level, that tip really only begins, I think, to develop as a campaign beds in, because players start to have stakes in different factions. They have relationships with different NPCs. They've had some bad guys get away before, or the bad guys have advanced in a particular area. And all of this, I think, creates a meta challenge where they have to think, okay, how do we deal with these emerging problems now that we have a grasp of the situation? But early on, the main challenge you need to think about is not, how do I create really interesting meta level challenges, but just be like, okay, let's get a good dungeon. You know, I like the fact that this dungeon I'm reading, you know, players have 3 paths through it, and they're really clearly signposted as the kinds of challenges that might be on them. And you know, the players are going to have to really come up with good solutions to that. Great, you know, whatever. That sounds fun. And that's what you should focus on. So yeah, just to sum that up, we said world first. Think about what kind of, in this very small scope at the start of the campaign, what kind of stuff needs to be there for the world to make sense to the players, and for the world to have an existence separate from the characters, so the characters can then impact upon it. Second, player driven. Giving choices early is usually, not always, but usually good. It gives players a sense of ownership. It deprograms that idea of the game being a story that gets told to you. And in the campaign, you want to create some good early choices that are fun, not necessarily incredibly deep and meaningful, but fun. And third, challenge oriented. We're mostly in the early stages of a campaign, starting a campaign, just thinking about have challenging dungeons. Over the course of a campaign, I'll talk about this another time, over the course of a campaign, you're going to get some of the bigger meta challenges. But initially, challenging dungeon, because that is what Dungeons and Dragons will usually tend to. I'm going to give 3 examples now. I've just got them next to me of good campaigns, published campaigns, and just talk about a bit of how they do this, I think. Now, one thing is, lots of campaign supplements out there which are quite useful are not really complete campaigns. World of Greyhawk, which I use for my Greyhawk game, not a complete campaign. It's an odd product. The Grey Box Forgotten Realms box, which is very good. Many classic D&D people would agree. Even though it's got a lot of good stuff in it, there's still a lot presumed on the DM to kind of, this is just a world, here's some sample adventures, here's some ideas. There are very few kind of plug in and run campaign settings out there that you really can just pick up, and with a read through and a couple of evenings of thinking about stuff and writing a few bits and pieces up, you can just run. But these 3 are pretty much that. So we'll talk about one I've picked up. One example of it. There are others. Castles Interland. This is the kind of, there is one big dungeon in the campaign. There may not be very much else. Mega dungeons like Stonehell, Barrow Maze, Anomalous Subsurface Environment, which I've run, I think is really good. They fit into this, and Castles Interland is smaller than those. It is maybe a kilo dungeon. I don't know. These terms are debated, but it is a very good large dungeon, which is essentially the whole campaign. Designed for sort of epic 6 rules. You know, you cap out at level 6 anyway. In this case, let's think world first. Well, the world consists in Zinterland. It consists of a town, Tour-en-Savoy, and it consists of Castle Zinterland, and that's about it. and there doesn't need to be anything else because the game consists of this. And there's a conceit there, but it doesn't breach the idea of world first. There is a dungeon, and there's sub-factions within the dungeon, and they want these things, and they're doing these things, and it's a situation where there's equilibrium to start with. So it's not like N1, it's not like Deep Carbon Observatory. There is an equilibrium that the players interrupt. So it's fairly static to begin with, and there are a few potential side adventures in Tour on Savoy. Things like, oh, maybe you are going to break into the church crypt, that kind of thing. You could add stuff. You can also do stuff. Some people put this into Dolmenwood, for instance. That's a common thing I've heard. But the point is that this is just something where you're like, this is the game we're playing. Anomalous Subsurface Environment, I ran a multi-level campaign there. And in that case, the player, it's set up as they're going to get up to some stuff in Denethix, the main city. There's regional encounter tables, and there are a few third-party adventures for it. So even once they're at the ASE, I also added the Nightwolf into it. Even once they're at the Mega Dungeon, there might be some other stuff to do, but usually the loop is they might do a small side quest, something they pick. Oh, let's go and explore a room in the Nightwolf Inn. Oh, we've heard this rumor of this cemetery, that kind of thing. Or, we've been given some small job. The DM has come up with some kind of small job within Denethix for us to do, just as a bit of entertainment. But then they go back to the ASE. That's the basic dynamic of that module. And players will tend to understand this. The logic of the world is that these are the things in the world, and this is the exciting centerpiece. And the players are usually impacting an equilibrium. ASE has some other bits and pieces, but you get the idea. What about player driven then in this case? Because there's only one dungeon, right? Okay, well that means it's not player driven because you're forcing them to go to the dungeon. Well, that's rather, I think, beggaring the question, because isn't that the case with all adventures and all campaigns? No campaign actually has infinite things to do, like the players reformulate a series of sounds into a completely random, meaningless set of sounds, and you interpret it to mean a new setting. No, you've put 3 adventures down, or you've put a mega dungeon down. Doesn't matter. The player choice in a big dungeon, medium size or big like Stonehell, is they can think, which way are we going to go through this large environment, this complex environment? Which route we take? There's many ways in. And there's things, last time we went this way, but that seemed dangerous. Maybe we can go this way. Or, we went that way and we encountered an obstacle we couldn't surmount, but now we have a plan. So it's rather that the choices are within a large, complex environment, and the environment is the dungeon. And challenge oriented, well, this is really at the high end of that, because the challenges are, these tend to be full of tricks and traps and lots of gimmicks and things the players have to deal with, and weird ideas, and often factions. And so all the challenges that happen within a dungeon actually are now what constitute the campaign, because it's a single dungeon campaign. Second, this is the sort of freewheeling, there is no main thing kind of campaign. These are the Slumbering Ursine Dunes books. Slumbering Ursine Dunes, Fever Dreaming Marlinko. This is by Chris Kutelik. Zintaland is by Gabor Lux. Misty Isles of the Eld, and What Ho Frog Demons. I should say Gabor Lux's campaign settings that come in echoes from Fomalhaut. I think Kasura, his recent standalone campaign setting release, these fall into more of this category. Like, there's lots of just stuff out there, and this is a weird one, because I know if it's only occasionally updated, but if you did get onto Kutelik's Patreon, he did put up a kind of a mega hack of all these products together, but which would be a great thing to exist. But yeah, What Ho Frog Demons is sort of the framing device for the rest of these, and that's what's relevant. Here you have 2 adventures for lower levels. You've got a big rumour table full of things you could go and do. You've got a hex crawl with hexes of interest. You've got bestiary and frog demon generator, bucolic village generator. Just the players say, let's say, and this is a perfectly classic thing. Rumours can be in any of these. I think Zintaland, for instance, has rumours. But let's say you roll your d12, and the rumour you get is, some say that Jeremiel, the old smith and familial patriarch of Kugelberg, just outside Slumbering Ursine Dunes, is a living aspect of the almighty puissant Sun Lord himself. He hides a great magic chariot fabulously adorned in gold in his barn. Or again, that old goat Jaromil, Owen Kugelberg, is having an entirely inappropriate pen pal romance with a teenage servant, Svetlana, in Kitrovit Manor. Those are two things. You go and look into Jaromil in the Slumbering Ursine Dunes, or you could go over to the manor, or you can just wander around. Just say, which direction shall we go? And there's a certain degree of this is high on many of these kind of dials in terms of world first. Well, it's a world that the players are going to impact a lot, but it's just a bunch of stuff. It's there's no story. There's not even like a single dungeon the players are focusing on which has specific secrets. It's just a bunch of stuff that gains value more, not randomly, but randomly in the sense, and let's say blindly, not randomly but blindly, because there's just so much stuff, and it's not necessarily connected to each other. There is something where it's comprehensible as a world that has lots of different things going on, but it's not comprehensible as a single item. It's very player driven because you just say each player, there's a D12 table of rumours. We've got 5 players. Each of you roll a D12, and then there's a sub-table weighty conversation as well. So there's 17 possible results functionally. So you roll, okay, this is what you get. What are you going to do? What are you going to do session 1? Okay, you've got some rumours pulling you this way, you've got rumours pulling you this way, what do you want to do? Anyway, that's very player driven because the DM, what you find is sometimes DM will say, oh, this doesn't seem fun, I don't want to do this, I want to run this. Fair enough, in which case you lead with the rumours you want to run. But the way that this is offered up by Kuchlik is very player driven because it says, look, just roll on the table and do the stuff that the players then pick from the table, basically, or just do random stuff. They go north from the starting location, they go south. It's a hex map, so they can go 6 directions. And challenge oriented, well, the challenge here is going to be that there's a bunch of stuff going on in this particular product, but it's low level, so it's to begin with, and it's BX, it's Labyrinth Lord. Designed for. So much like Zintalan, it's mostly going to stay at low level. There might be some factional things that develop, and there certainly are some kind of meta objectives you can pick up, but especially early on, it's going to be about which of these dangerous places are you going? Are you going to the Slumbering Ursine Dunes? Are you going to go to deal with the beats for the beat god, which is certainly a lower level environment in this context? Are you going to go for something else the DM's kind of made up? Are you going to go for that hedge maze of the evil druid, which is the other kind of semi-official product within this line, which I think was free on drive-through? The challenge is going to be what you find in there. Because of the particular dynamic, this is one way in which often Lab Lord, BX and games like that are very slightly at a camber from what I think was challenge oriented, is that there can be a degree of just, okay, look, the challenge is insurmountable. It's just this crazy stuff that a lot of this is a generator for wild stories afterward, mostly of defeat. And I think that can be a danger of stripping away the idea that you can beat the challenges through good play, which I think is very important and central to this classic D&D idea. I don't think it's absent. I'm just saying that is a tension there within this specific product. But in this kind of product, like in Gabolux's campaign settings, and similar things in the same genre where, Dolmenwood, I'm thinking more Wormskin in terms of what I'm most familiar with, Wormskin / Poetry in Dolmenwood. This idea of you get a rumour table maybe, or you're in a location and there's people you can talk to, and you explore, and there's not, certainly that's that Dolmenwood Poetry and Wormskin Poetry and Dolmenwood, which I ran for many years, which is just like, hey, what do you want to do next? What matters to you? My players very early encountered Merridwen Skymes, and therefore found out about the Lord of the Mayor of Langston asked them to go and find out about Merridwen Skymes, and so they found out he had a problem, which means that they spent multiple levels, 3 levels of gameplay, going around finding out and getting a solution to Merwin Skimes' problem so they could solve the Lord's problem. But they obviously saw loads of other stuff and did loads of other adventures, more or less just like, oh, well, we've heard about a rumour of something going on over here, let's go there. And that's how that works. So, yeah, that's the second kind of thing which I think can fit this, world-first, player-driven, challenge-oriented format. The final one is one which may have an objective at the end, I suppose, and it doesn't have to, but Night Below is my example by Carl Sargent. Throwback in the second edition era. It's even in the black trade dress. That was the generic. Technically, it's a Greyhawk product originally, then got genericized. And here the idea is the players turn up in a place, they don't know what's going on. It is an interesting thing that, of course, at that point, the DM who gets this and his players aren't buying products are going to be surprised by the twists and turns. Now, if you advertise I'm running Night Below, people know, okay, eventually we're going to go and fight some aboleths. There's an interesting thing there about, and the same with any goal-oriented kind of campaign. The goal here is it's not a goal that is set up as the players know from the start they have to do all this stuff and there's one path through. A big emphasis is made, and it's most true in the probably in the first and third chapters, particularly the first big section, the Evils of Harrenshire. But the idea is that they turn up in a place and they fight some bandits early on. That's kind of in media res setup functionally. And then they can just travel around and there's a bunch of different things that they might hear about from going to different villages, talking to different people, befriending the rangers, different rumours, some of which are going to connect to why magic users are being kidnapped and some of which aren't. And they're just going to be side quests in video game parlance. But here there is if there's a lack in this kind of model in the world first thing, it is that there is a core thing that you're going to be encouraging the players to engage with, and it's not static like the dungeon. It's dynamic, which isn't necessarily bad, but it's something which can quickly, because it's so dynamic, it can quickly both warp the logic of the world. The world exists to have this story be told in it, and it can warp the player-driven aspect of things. You have to go and choose this because that's what the game is. There's actually a few ways to kind of slightly get round that. You add more stuff into the world. You slow down any timeline suggested. Oh, this, if you don't stop it within 90 days time, the evil people destroy the world. Actually, you can just be like, no, that doesn't happen. In my very long-running Forgotten Realms campaign, originally exploring Chult, there's a thing where the soulmonger is causing these problems where people can't get resurrection in Chult, and it's spreading out across the world, and eventually everyone's souls will be eaten when they die. That's bad, by the way. I just made it like, okay, that has a small zone of effect, and it's not spreading particularly quickly, because that's not really central or important to running a exploring hex crawl in the world. In fact, it's a distraction because it presses the players to chase that instead. But yes, the point is that you can have things where there is a fairly open world. Tomb of Annihilation is a basis for a campaign, much weaker than Night Below. Night Below is very good at just having this interesting world that has a certain logic, a sense of, okay, these are the dynamics here, this is how these people work, these are their concerns. You start in this town pretty much, and so you find out about these rumours first. That creates the situation where players decide what things matter to them early on. And the challenge... I think one thing that it can be a risk also with the kind of freewheeling. There's just lots of stuff on a hex map. Certainly with this kind of thing, it can be that because there's a sense of, okay, many of these things exist to give information about the really important stuff that in this case is in the Underdark. I think there can be a sense in which the challenge takes second place to often quite small environments that are meant to maybe be fun. Hopefully, there's a cool battle there, or there's an interesting puzzle. But the challenge is secondary, and I think it's good to step back and think, okay, even if you're thinking, I want to start a campaign that, these are with my friends. We've played a 5-year campaign before. I know they can play through lots of sessions. You could be like, okay, so. And I think, you can read about some of this on Tony Husso's blog when he's talking about like switching from one campaign to the new one. You think eventually I want them to end up You know, a big mystery is going to be down in the Underdark in this case, or on the plains. They're going to get to level 8 or 9 and they're going to be doing this. That's not where they are initially, and you want to make sure the experience is actually D&D. It's not a story that gets them to the later content that actually matters. Just start them there if that's the case. But you want it to be that there is lots of stuff in the world. And one thing, probably not all that stuff re-world first, you want to be connected to the big thing. You want some stuff just like, there's goblins who have a weird ring, for instance. You want there to be some stuff which is just by the by, and which is an interesting diversion, even if there is one big mystery. I think you can spread that out. If you just get away from the one big mystery thing and maybe have many big mysteries, that's fun too, and that can set the basis of an essentially endless campaign of constant exploration. I find this with my Forgotten Realms campaign, 6 years old now, which is just, okay, there's all this stuff we can go and do, and what do we want to do today? And we really need to press into this because this is the Sargon are a rising threat, or the Nightmare Librarian from the DCO who escaped. You know, these are rising threats. Oh, but we also need to do this, or our friend's soul has been taken, that kind of thing. All these things are going on. So maybe that's the one thing, is as much as I love Night Below, the one big mystery thing can be a millstone around the neck of a campaign. It can also be a great focus, but I think it can be a millstone around the classic campaign because it can warp so many of these pillars. And stepping back and saying there are many big mysteries allows you to say, okay, world first, these are the factions in the world and these are how they work, and these are the things that the players are going to be interacting with, and this is the logic of the world. Player driven, well, they're going to pick what's more important to them between those. So for instance, this does exist in my Greyhawk game, but the players haven't, engaged with it. They're not down in that region at the moment. If they ever go there, they will. If another Greyhawk group starts up, it can connect with stuff in that region. The Yeomanry is near Kaerland, so it could also connect to the U trilogy, things like that. Finally, challenge oriented. Well, if you have multiple big things going on, you can somewhat pick stuff that is good, rather than like, oh, I really like the end game here. And then you're often having to jimmy stuff. If you want challenge, you're often having to jimmy out the stuff that doesn't work and put in stuff that does. You can just be a bit more, either one thing, you can be more selective. You can have 3 things that are good and work. There's 3 big mysteries that you just think are good. But 2, you can also be a bit more relaxed about messing around with the material, because the whole thing is a lot less about telling the story that's in the box set and a lot more about the world that you've created for the players to play in, the sandbox you've created. So yeah, just to kind of sum these points up about the campaign type of classic game. 1, you can just either write your own or pick a big dungeon, and it needs to be a dungeon there's lots of choices and lots of challenges within. It needs to be compelling for the players to go back and do week after week. I think that can become a limitation for this format, but it's very strong on the idea that it's going to be challenging, because that's the only thing it has going for, in terms of, that's the big thing it has going for it, is there's so many challenges. It's such a contained environment of challenge, and the choices need to be between how to cope with what challenge there are, how to maximize the haul out of it, things like that. The second is the picaresque adventure. So that's the kind of the mega dungeon. Here's the picaresque. Here your risks are that in a sense there's so much the players can't necessarily engage or quite really know what's going on. Nothing seems to connect. But that can also be a strength. There's lots of choice, and the choice will feel very distinct. The mega dungeon may have weird sub-levels, but usually it's going to feel like one or other flavour of dungeon. Whereas here you could be like, oh, why don't we go on this wildernessy trek? In fact, here, when we think about it, you've got a couple of point crawly mini wildernesses. You have a city with some dungeons inside it, and you have here, this has both a hex crawl with mini adventures, as well as a dungeon, and a sort of social / combat adventure with some dungeon elements in a village. Loads of different things you can do in that. Lots of variety early on. The challenge can sometimes lack because a lot of stuff is quite small, and it can tend towards the vignette rather than towards the adventure proper, where the players are really conquering challenges. The trick there is to pause and to carefully think about what you're putting on the map. Is this going to be interesting? Is it going to be challenging? is going to test stuff in my players, you know, and in their characters. And the final one is the kind of big mystery, big story, but which is not linear, but there's a lot of space to play around in. In chapter 1, you go all around the overmap, the overworld, doing all kinds of connected and unconnected adventures. Chapter 3, when you're fighting the Ableth, there's loads of ways to do it. So, you know, lots of choices, for player choice, and particularly in those early stages, it's a fairly coherent world. But this runs risks of becoming not classic because of the issues with stuff is there to advance the plot, not to be challenging. The players do kind of get to choose, but they don't really get to choose. Chapter 2 of this, the second book, there's a lot of like, just go down. This is essentially linear. You just need to go between different places to solve problems you're kind of told about by another NPC. That's not real player choice at the campaign level, even if there is a choice within the specific dungeon or whatever. And the world can begin to, once the players begin to perceive that the world exists to tell them a story, the world itself holds less interest. There's nothing to comprehend, there's nothing to work out. You're just waiting for the DM to tell you what the important part of the world is. Okay, well, I guess that's where the main plot is, we'll go there. But yeah, so a solution to that can be step back and dump a lot of big mysteries on the map. Okay, there's this and this and this. And it doesn't matter if the players don't access it all, you know, unless you spent millions of hours writing it. What matters is that it relativizes any one story and creates a world which it could be very interesting with competing interests and conflicting factions, but also creates space for players to solve problems how they want to and prioritize what they think is interesting. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts on classic campaigns, how to start them, how to set them up. As I say, I'll probably do one about maintaining them sometime. But that would require a bit of refining. That's going to be stuff like, okay, how do you keep dynamics interesting? How do you develop factions? How do you integrate player kind of ambitions into things? But that's probably a bit more complex. I think next time, what might be a good thing to do is to talk about. Maybe we could talk about the wilderness next time. I don't know. Talk about the wilderness and how it fits into the classic D&D campaign. Anyway, put your ideas on that and your thoughts on what I've said today in the comments, and I'll see you next time.